Our presentation is on attachment disorders. Those that will be presenting are Natalie Givens, Robin Newman, Marcy Olney, and Natalie Williams. It's impossible to talk about attachment disorders without discussing this topic in light of God's Word and the fall of man. The fall of man forever impacted the relational health of all people. In Genesis 3, we understand that Adam and Eve were created and God gave them free will. They shared a loving, reciprocal, and transparent relationship with God. Both were naked, and yet they were unashamed. At that time, everything was perfect. We also know that Eve was tempted by the serpent to be like God, and she makes the decision to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which was forbidden. She then shares the fruit with Adam. The result of that choice and disobedience to God was catastrophic to mankind. The most devastating effect was the disruption of mankind's transparent and loving relationship with God. Although we are made in the Imago Dei with the capacity and longing to connect, since sin was introduced into the world and our human nature corrupted by the curse, it has been a struggle for us to connect with God and others. Although attachment disorders are extreme forms of behavior typically resulting from some kind of abuse, neglect, or trauma, mankind has struggled to reconnect with God and others as a whole as a result of the fall. It's interesting to note that attachment disorders were first formally defined as a disorder in the third edition of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in 1980. That manual was subsequently updated in 2013 as DSM-5. For almost 20 years, attachment disorders attracted little attention because individuals were unable to really understand when aberrant behavior was the result of an attachment disorder rather than an insecure attachment type. Today, there is a broad consensus in support of Bowlby's theory that in early childhood, attachment disorders result in inadequate caregiving environments and results in two clinical patterns. We're going to talk about reactive attachment disorder, which is emotionally withdrawn, inhibited individuals, and DSED, disinhibited social engagement disorder, which is characteristic of indiscriminately social and disinhibited individuals. There are a number of experiences that can lead to attachment disorders. I've listed some here, but this is not an all-inclusive list. Each person's attachment style or disorder is really specific to the individual. But some of the reasons could include abuse and neglect, trauma, loss of or separation from a parent, the quality of the attachment that the individual receives from the primary caregiver, the individual's temperament or disposition, whether or not the individual was born prematurely, whether they had any medical conditions before the age of 2, and children that have been institutionalized. There are a number of different effects of attachment disorders, and specifically RAD and DSED. There are learning difficulties, which result in immature speech. Individuals may have learning delays, problems with basic literacy and math, and lack of cause and effect thinking. Individuals with RAD and DSED may also exhibit obsessions. They'll hide food, there's hoarding, they may be fascinated by death, violence, or fire, and they may exhibit eating disorders. In terms of behavior, we see in RAD and DSED individuals that their behavior is destructive, they have no remorse for their actions, they're very impulsive without considering consequences, they question everything, they may steal belongings that don't belong to them, they have inappropriate sexual behaviors, and are prone to substance or alcohol abuse. As far as relationships, some of the behaviors that are demonstrated could be that the individual is clingy or needy, they have difficulty maintaining friendships, they resist affection or comfort, they're very affectionate with strangers, very aggressive, and hostile towards their parents.
Attachment disorders cause us to suffer from many things that affect our social interactions. Many of those things are brought to light and overcome through counseling, which is why counseling is important when dealing with any mental illness, including attachment disorders. Counseling helps break down the thought processes and habits that are attributed to attachment disorders and retrain our brain to look for and gain strong and supportive relationships through new and healthy bonds. Healthy relationships and bonds can help cope with and prevent depression, anxiety, and other mental health diseases. Attachment-based therapy allows counselors and/or therapists to evaluate their clients' lives and their connections between early childhood attachments, the experiences they encountered, along with their relationships in later on adulthood. People that often suffer from unhealthy or insecure attachments have hurtful relationships later on in adulthood as well. Knowing the correlation and the signs of those, counselors and therapists are able to help develop coping skills, rebuild trusting bonds, and also encourage emotional security and safety within a session. Attachment-based therapy allows counselors and/or therapists to evaluate their clients' lives and their connections between early childhood attachments, the experiences they encountered, along with their relationships in later on adulthood. People that often suffer from unhealthy or insecure attachments have hurtful relationships later on in adulthood as well. Knowing the correlation and the signs of those, counselors and therapists are able to help develop coping skills, rebuild trusting bonds, and also encourage emotional security and safety within a session.
So, statistically speaking, there is not much information or much research done on attachment disorders in minority groups, which I will touch on why that's an issue. It also is very important to acknowledge how the lack of awareness or the lack of research, lack of material diagnosis, the ideas that cultural relativity is not relevant to the dissection or the understanding of attachment disorders, and how because the fundamental tenets of attachment theory, which would be a caregiver sensitivity, competence, so much information to be found about, of course, attachment disorders from infancy during the being diagnosed to being researched in minority groups. Being a minority myself, those three tenets can vary. I was not surprised to see some of the information that I did read about. However, I do believe that it is something that needs to be talked about. Basically, do not incorporate race and ethnicity into their studies. Because they seem to reign supreme more attention than what it has been based on the research that I found. But incorporating the variations of culture into how culture those three tenets we communicate and affects the way that others communicate, being on the outside looking in, affects because the caregiver sensitivity sometimes may not work for certain ethnicities or some cultural backgrounds. Knowledgeable about the things that they are experiencing, competence the things that they are feeling, and how their culture relates to the way that they process, the way that they feel, the way that they communicate. Because overall it makes us better counselors and better natural helpers, helping ourselves understand where these groups are coming from and why they struggle with the things that they do. In terms of the hierarchy of the way that they respect their elders, that they suppress their emotions, even though they keep everything within the family. It's in a respectable way, but it's not in an emotional, expressive way. So that consistent learning of behavior to repress emotions or to keep things to themselves, or not to want to dishonor their family name, or to dishonor what the culture says that is respectable or honorable for where they come from. Those tend to form into avoided dismissive attachment styles, as well as resulting in a high levels of depression, anxiety, and negative mood. Also, in relation to that, you have the African American community who scores high in those areas as well. Actually, the African American community and the Asian American community, as well as the Latina community, which are the three that I will be discussing, all score very high in the dismissive avoidance styles. Also score very high in attachment anxiety, depression, anxiety, and negative mood disorder. So with the differences in cultural norms, you have minority groups who come from different backgrounds. You have an African American community where they value the extended family, or there are different parental figures in the lives of African American children. And those different influences or family styles or cultural norms heavily do influence their levels of communication, influence their perception of what love is, or what healthy attachment is, or what healthy communication is. Because if there are so many intertwining personalities, so many intertwining factors with how a concentrated area of people communicate, it can definitely change their growth and their levels of healthy or unhealthy attachment disorders. So a lot of different things that I noticed in the research was that the cultural norms of African American community, Asian American community, and the Latino American community showed a lot of pressures from the outside. So you have in the African American community, in some studies, there are students who were placed into an environment where they were, of course, the minority, just say on a college campus or at a private white institute, and they scored very high on attachment avoidance simply because of cultural mistrust. So being the minority in a room, whereas these numbers look very different for white Americans, being the minority in a room does cause for a issue with racial identity, and because of that racial identity, even starting at a very young age, it can cause for attachment disorders or attachment styles to be avoidant or dismissive of other cultures, of other races, of other backgrounds, because of lack of knowledge, because of ignorance of social or cultural norms, and scoring so high on the attachment avoidance style also is a representation of a lack of representation of that culture. So with Latin Americans and African Americans scoring so high on the attachment avoidant style because of cultural mistrust, that also builds a level of anxiety, that builds a level of isolation, that builds a level of internalizing those issues. Another thing that I noticed was that in the Latin American community, they did not score as high on depression and anxiety. But in reference to family norms, they scored very high, very similarly to the African American community, about close-knit family ties and how those relationships and those ties are very, very important on the nuclear side of the family versus the extended side of the family. But something that's very similar in the Latino community and the African American community is that extended family. But the closer knit that a family was, the more protective that those representatives will be over parental figures, over authority figures, but they will lack trust with anyone outside of their nuclear family. So I believe that in the research that I've done, these minority groups show very similar scores in their attachment disorders, and I believe that the lack of research or the lack of findings or the lack of data concerning this topic is very important. So, statistically speaking, there is not much information or much research done on attachment disorders in minority groups, which I will touch on why that's an issue towards the end of this sound clip.
After studying
but the overall
attachment
issue
disorders,
for there
I
being a
realized
lack
that
of
even though
material
human beings are
is
meeting
that
Imago
the
Dei,
idea is that cultural
which means at
relativity
the
is
center of
not
all of
relevant
us
to the
is the
dissection
ability
or the
and desire to
understanding of
connect with God
attachment
and
disorders,
others.
because the
Not
fundamental
all of
tenets
us
of
have
attachment theory,
formed
which would be
secure
caregiver
relationships.
sensitivity,
I do know
competence,
that
and the
secure
secure basis,
relationships are a
of course, those
foundation
are
to
formed from
promoting spiritual
infancy during
health
the
and mental
time periods
well-being.
that
I
they're
believe
developed
that
and
at the root of
solidified
many
until the age of
spiritual and
3.
emotional
Those three
problems
tenets
is the failure
can
of an
vary
individual to
based
connect
on
because of
culture,
insecure
but
attachment
the
styles or
westernized view
attachment
or the
disorders.
westernized ideals
As
of attachment
counselors, I
theory
believe attachment theory
basically
provides
do
an
not incorporate
understanding
race
of the
and
development
ethnicity
of
into their
ineffective
studies
coping strategies
because they seem
and the
to reign
underlying
supreme or be the same
dynamics of a
across
person's
all
emotional
boards of study.
difficulties. which can
But
serve as the
incorporating the
basis for
variations
helping
of
us as
culture into
counselors in
those three
identifying
tenets
and
definitely
resolving an
do change
individual's
simply
problems.
because culture
I believe there needs
affects
to be more
what
research
caregiver
conducted to
sensitivity is.
fully
In some
understand the impact of early attachment and
ethnicities or
future
some cultural
relationships,
backgrounds,
including
caregiver sensitivity can
identifying
look
certain
different. Competence looks
interventions and
different, and secure
techniques that are
basis
effective
looks
for treating
different. So,
such
for
disorders.
example, you have the Asian American community who, based on statistics, score very high in attachment anxiety and